everybody. Thanks for hanging in there and coming. My name is Heather Somerville. I'm a technology reporter. I work for Reuters. I'm based in San Francisco. And I'm here with Bobby Franklin, CEO of the National Venture Capital Association. We're going to talk a little bit about diversity, inclusion, treatment of women in this industry. And we'll definitely leave some time at the end for your voices, so we have as diverse set of voices as possible on this discussion today. Bobby, do you want to start with just giving people the rundown of what you do at the NVCA?
Sure, happy to. Bobby Franklin, President and CEO of the National Venture Capital Association. We are what is very common in Washington, D.C. to be a trade association. There are probably hundreds of thousands of trade associations that you've probably never heard of. I used to have to compare something that we did with the, let me get this right, the Southern Minnesota Sugar Beet Growers Association. So that sort of gives you an idea of how specific it gets. But NVCA has been around since the mid-'70s, and principally we were put together to work on public policy issues that are important to the entrepreneurial ecosystem and to the investors in it. But also as a trade association, we're probably best known for our model legal documents and trying to help the industry by putting out at least a starting point for deal documents and others.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we all know the statistics. We all know that there aren't enough women in tech, there aren't enough people of color in tech, and not that much has happened to change that. So now that we have the knowledge and there's a global movement happening with Me Too and others, I think the time to ask the question is the question to ask really is what now? So I want to talk a little bit about the NVCA's role in addressing diversity, inclusion, and treatment of women in tech. Now, last month, the NVCA put out a series of documents, HR policies and code of conduct suggestions for venture capital firms. Can you talk a little bit about what those policies say and what the response was among venture capital firms to them?
Sure. Well, it was just a couple weeks ago, so we don't have a lot of feedback yet, although we did notice on our website we know they've been downloaded hundreds of times, so that's a good sign since it's only 2 weeks out. But what if I can back up to get to this point, I started at the end of 2013, and one of the first things, and I didn't know the venture industry. I'm a Washington person. I've been there since the late 80s. I worked in telecom, I've worked in agriculture, I've worked in international trade, I've worked in lots of different industries. And so when I got hired, it was not because I had deep knowledge of venture capital, it was because I had deep knowledge of Washington and managing trade associations. And so one of the first things that sort of came to my attention, not that it had been new at that point, it had been recognized for some time, but I began to understand the lack of diversity and inclusion in our industry. And so the question was, okay, you're taking over this organization, are you going to make this a priority? And the answer was absolutely. And so we created a task force to work on diversity and inclusion. We listened and learned a lot from a lot of folks. It's great that we have corporate venture members because corporations have had, HR functions and diversity programs and diversity managers and others for a long time. And so they have a running head start for a lot of the good tools that can be put in place. And so fast forward to beginning of this past year, we talked with our board about hitting a refresh button on what had been the diversity task force. We want to do a couple of things. Number one, we didn't want to call it a task force because that implies that there's something that you need to solve and you're going to be done with it quick, and then you disband the task force. And so what we have done is refreshed our efforts, and it's called Venture Forward. And the idea there is to try to indicate that we're going to keep marching forward, we're going to keep doing the right things, we're going to keep including as many great ideas and tools in the stuff that we share with the industry and try to get it out there. And getting back to your question about what we just released, as we were refreshing the Venture Forward, along came the news that hit everybody last June about all the brave women that came out and talked about what they had experienced and the fallout that happened for those individuals who were absolutely bad actors doing the wrong thing.
We're talking about binary capital, Justin Callback, and basically implosion of that firm, Dave McClure being removed from his post, among other, really the result of good journalism.
Bunch
and
of
brave women speaking up.
brave women and great journalism, and I credit both for what happened. And so what we realized then is, well, wait a minute, we've been focused on the broader diversity and inclusion, and we realized we had just released model HR policies, kind of to go along with the model legal documents. The focus of them, and that was in March of 2017, the focus of them were to help firms that want to become more diverse and inclusive to think about what their HR policies say to prospective job applicants and others. Do you have maternity leave policies? How do you treat certain situations? All that. It wasn't meant to be an entire handbook. It was really focused on how to help people attract a more diverse and inclusive workforce. And then this hit, and so we went back and we said, well, wait a minute, we need to update those to make sure that there are provisions to address sexual harassment, to address what do you do, that sort of thing.
And that would suggest that a lot of these suggestions are very basic. That would suggest that there are plenty of firms out there who didn't even have the most basic provisions in place to say there will be consequences if you harass someone. Is that what you found?
Well, big firms have all sorts of resources. They have HR departments, they have policies in place. But what we know in this industry is that we've seen a barbell effect over the last several years, if not more, where the big firms raise bigger funds and you have this explosion of micro VC firms. Many times these are 2, 3, 4, 5 people. So certainly at a firm when there's only a handful of people, they don't have HR departments, they likely don't have policies in place. And so because there are so many of them, hundreds of firms of that size, we thought, well, the best thing we can do is help curate some model policies so they don't have to go, with all due respect to any lawyers in the audience, they don't have to go pay law firms to do sort of the same thing over and over. It's kind of what led us to the model legal documents in the first place. We can help the industry. And so that's what sort of led us to, we can do work, curate what is a good set of policies and make them freely available to others.
So you can offer these suggestions, these guidelines, these best practices, but as you've said to me, the NVCA isn't like a bar association that can strip a lawyer of a license to practice. There's limits, and probably rightfully so, as to the authority that you have. So one question I have is, what about the limited partners? They would seemingly have plenty of leverage. They provide the money to the venture capital firms. Where are they in this conversation, and what could or should they be doing to demand that both the venture firm itself has good practices and good hiring traditions, and that the companies that they invest in also represent that diversity and inclusion?
Well, I can't speak for the limited partners, but I have friends there, the Institutional Limited Partners Association. We do a lot of work with. In fact, one of a former colleague at NVCA works over there, Emily Mendel, and just recently she was on a panel, Wall Street Journal panel, talking about this issue. And you can tell they're in the middle of a CEO change, so they're doing a search for a new CEO, and perhaps that's why they haven't been out there as much. They're in a leadership void right now. But Emily and others that are there, Jen Choi, are very much in contact with us. We spend a lot of time with them. They want to be a part of this conversation. They are part of this conversation. When we put a workshop together last August, we invited them. They came. Several fund of funds and other limited partners were there. So I think they're definitely a part of this conversation.
A question about possible backlash. And we've sort of seen this in the Me Too movement more broadly, but I've heard stories of either individual partners or entire firms saying, well, let's not have any meetings with a female founder after 5 p.m. and let's not do it at a restaurant or a bar or hotel lobby or anything that could be misconstrued, which, if you adopt that sort of practice, what are you denying female founders? So there's also the pendulum swinging in the opposite direction. Do you guys have any guidance to mitigate that or prevent that from happening?
Well, what we're focused on, and this is a big part of our venture forward now that we've kind of hit the refresh on this, is we want peers talking to peers. I mean, for the lobbyists, and I think that was actually one of the headlines that somebody wrote, was it you? When we released the documents, like, the venture capital lobbyist tells the industry what they should do or something like that. I forgot the headline. But what we're trying to do is make sure that we share good and positive things that people are doing, and there are a lot of them. And we did it in this sort of guest blog series that's ongoing. And even in the last 3 days, I've had several other VCs that are members, or maybe they're even not a member of NVCA. They said, I want to put my voice out there, and I want to talk about what we're doing. And the theory is, if peers can see what others are doing to contribute to positive outcomes and to an eventual solution, then it's easier for them to do that. I think in the beginning, and particularly when we started our listening and learning session, there were a lot of conversations about how we got here. And I understand it's important to understand how you got here so you know you don't go back there and you know you're going forward. But at a certain point, you sort of have to focus on, okay, there's not a simple one answer here. So how can we identify a lot of answers? And how can we encourage a lot of folks to move forward? And one of the things, and you and I talked about this when we had a preview call for this session, one of the things that I find interesting and challenging is that for all of the things I know that are going on that are positive, I see so many of the folks that are afraid to share what they're doing for fear that they lay out, hey, this is a step we're taking, and they get ridiculed because they're not perfect. And so, it was important for a couple of the blog posts that have been put up on our website for folks to talk about. I know that I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to take, stands or steps in the right direction. And I think that's something that, sort of collectively we all need to understand and make sure we're encouraging the right behavior.
Can you share an example from one of those guest blogs of somebody who's taken a step in the right direction and what that step was?
So one example is Greg Sands, Costanoa, who, I think in his title it says something about, it doesn't need to be perfect, but we just need to take steps. What he did is he made sure that he's a brand new firm, just 2 years old, and he took steps to make sure that he found a way to bring in women or underrepresented minorities to work alongside them. He didn't hire, he's too new to hire a new, general partner, but he wanted to make the opportunity for people to get experience working in the industry so that they can build their resume and then have an opportunity to start their own firm or move somewhere else. And, it's a small step, but a very important step. And I think what is great about what he did and his willingness to talk about it is that somebody else that, probably viewed this as, oh my gosh, we know our roadmap for a firm is not to grow our general partnership. So I will probably never be able to say that, now we're 50-50 at the GP ranks. But this gave them an example of what they can do to positively contribute to the success of people down the road.
Okay. In 2015, Ellen Powell went to court against Kleiner Perkins in a lawsuit that alleged harassment and retaliation, and lost that lawsuit. But the case started really a global conversation about the lack of women in venture capital and more broadly in tech. And there was a lot of media coverage, there were lots of conversations, and then not a whole lot happened. What's different this time than in 2015?
It's a great question. It feels like, I think that contributed to it. I think you can look back, we're probably on the 5-year anniversary of Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In movement. There are a lot of things that have happened that led us to this point. What was the tipping point? Perhaps it was the bad behavior. When it got, so real, so graphic, so, like, oh my gosh, you cannot turn your eyes away from what just happened. You have to recognize there's a problem. And, that's where I think the lack of diversity and inclusion and the issues of sexual harassment really get tied together. Most people believe that if it was a more diverse and inclusive workplace, we wouldn't have seen that type of behavior. I think there's still bad actors out there. We see that in other industries, and they've had policies and training and everything for decades. So you can't perhaps root out all bad behavior. But it feels like we just hit this tipping point last summer, and thank goodness we got there. But it's a really interesting question. I sort of analogize it, and this is probably not a good one to bring up, but it's in the news now. It's like, was it the Florida shooting that finally got us to talk more seriously about gun control? I mean, we've had lots of shootings and stuff, but at some point in the psyche of the public at large, or industries or groups at large, you hit a tipping point, and I think we finally hit it.
Okay. Just recently, the Cape Horse Center, which works on these issues, as you know, put out a whole website with a comprehensive report compiling third-party data as well as their own studies on women and minorities in tech. And one thing that they said is they really found that the issue stems from biases that start at pre-K. So they start at pre-K. There's all these biases against African Americans, against women that go through 12th grade, and then a new set of biases kick in at CS programs in college, and then you go on to raising funds if you're an entrepreneur and the biases that are there, and then you actually get a job in a tech, and women leave at a higher rate because of biases there. So that's a whole lot to contend with, and NVCA can't do that by itself. Do you foresee a way to collaborate with public education, higher education, and employers to begin to address all these biases? Because if they're going to exist in one area of a person's life, there's still going to be this problem.
Well, we want to work with as many people as we can. So the answer is yes to the question. I've now been through, I won't call it full training, but we have had unconscious bias trainers come talk to our board now 3 different times. I have learned what I didn't know about, which is bystander training. So that when you have, you basically train environments so that if something happens that shouldn't, that you sort of train all the bystanders to help take steps to sort of nip it in the bud and not let it fester and create a culture that you don't want. So, I've certainly learned a lot. We're trying to share what we have learned with our members. There's a long way to go, and there are a lot of other groups that are out there doing things, and we applaud that. We certainly don't have all the answers, and whatever we do alone is not nearly going to be enough. So we need everybody. If you think about it, and we think about this a lot, we call it the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And that includes universities, it includes entrepreneurs, it includes service providers, law firms, accounting firms. It includes the investors, it includes the angel community, it includes, you name it. I mean, we're all part of this giant ecosystem that helps start and grow companies. And I think everybody has a role to play here.
Hollywood has really tackled this issue as well. And, after some of the Weinstein revelations and others, Hollywood immediately created a commission, got funding for it, put Anita Hill in charge, set out a 5-year plan, very concrete steps, which tech has not done. Is there something that we can learn from Hollywood that we can implement in the technology industry to take similar concrete steps?
There could be. I saw that they had created this. I haven't seen a lot of the specifics, but like I said, we've never claimed to have the monopoly on the ideas. In fact, we have said, and I've tried to do this very transparently. I mean, if you go to our website and you see the blog post that I put out going back to when we created the Diversity Task Force, I've tried to be very upfront and open with everybody to say, we're going to take steps that we believe or that we have learned make sense for us to take. We're going to learn from other industries and corporations that have decades of experience here, and we're going to lay it out here. But we invite everyone to get in touch with us. Tell us if you think we're going down the wrong road. Tell us if you think we need to go down a different road. I think we can learn from all industries here.
I know, was it last year or the year before, the NVCA put out a survey to get some data on the, how frequently harassment and discrimination occurred in venture, and I think you told me yourself it wasn't necessarily the best created survey, and I know that it's been criticized as kind of not being scientifically sound in terms of getting accurate data. What are you guys doing about surveys and data collection to get some better data about the rates of discrimination and harassment?
Well, to be clear, I think what you're talking about are surveys that were actually done before I got there. There was one that was done. The one we did 2 years ago was with Deloitte,
Okay.
and we haven't been criticized on that.
Okay.
That was a human capital survey, and we have an online tool that you can go in and look at it. You can search by. It's got sort of a dashboard, and you can look by geography and other stuff and see how it changes in different parts of the country. I think prior to that, there had been some surveys that I don't even think they were released. It was more of a learning tool. And certainly before I got there, there had been some research that was done. And like so many, people basically go and look at pictures on websites. That's what has been criticized. And there's still a lot of people out there that are doing that.
Yeah.
I won't name one of your colleagues in your profession, but they did so recently this week. And they basically said, certain size firms, we had people go to websites and look at the investment professionals. Interestingly, in that particular case, they said we only looked at firms 100 million and above. And from our data, we know that the median size fund that was raised in 2017 was 60 million. So
Yeah.
you're excluding over half of the firms when you do that.
Yeah.
But
So when's your next survey going to be?
we are now working with Deloitte again to do that this year.
Okay. And
So
do you have
our-
a question regarding harassment on there?
I'm sure we will. But it's basically, we want to do it every 2 years. And then, just to give you insight, we would like to now add, maybe in the off years, instead of looking at the venture firms, we actually look at the portfolio companies so that we can start to measure what's happening there.
Okay.
Because a lot of the folks that become venture capitalists were former portfolio company executives.
Good. And I'll throw one more question at you before I let folks in the audience have their turn. There's this interesting issue that's happening now with individuals suing companies because believe they were discriminated against for being white and male. And so the best known scenario is James Damore, an ex-Google employee who was fired for claiming that women were biologically inferior to do the job. He has gotten a high-powered Republican attorney to help him with a lawsuit. There's another individual who worked at YouTube, a lawsuit, similar white males not having the same opportunity and being discriminated against because of diversity quotas. So what sort of difficulty does this pose for companies that are trying to be more diverse? And how does that affect this whole conversation?
I haven't seen those impact the people that are trying to move forward. I don't think they give too much credence into those. Nobody has come to me and said, "Oh, we can't do it because of what we see over there." I don't see any evidence of that.
Issue. Okay.
No.
Okay, great. Anyone have a question for Bobby? Or comment, for that matter? Just gonna let him off the hook. Okay.
So I'm curious as to what you think, how we change this part of the equation for women making pitches, digital founders making pitches to VCs. So I feel like we can do unconscious bias training and these sorts of things, but I've heard from founder after founder that like the business model itself, like they just want to get a fair shot at people running the numbers on it in the same way. I'll give you a really good example. A woman made a pitch for different kinds of rentals for bridesmaid dresses, and went immediately after or within the same time frame as a similar company pitched by a male that was like grooms, all sorts of suits and things for groomsmen, and a much bigger market for bridesmaid dresses, and the male raised capital, she was not able to. So how do we just get to avoid who the messenger is and get VCs to look at the numbers, run the numbers from an unbiased way?
I think the way this is going to change the fastest is if we can get more research that shows that diverse teams make better decisions. There is a lot out there. And I'm sorry?
We need more studies on it?
Not studies. I think we need, I don't think there have been studies that say diverse teams make better decisions. I don't think there's been a lot of research done that shows the quantifiable return numbers. Like, this group of diverse investors earned more money and made smarter decisions in their fund than this group. I think if you can get to that level, this change happens a lot faster. And so one of the things, I was in a conversation with a well-known foundation just 2 weeks ago in DC, and this was the conversation. They wanted to know, what can we do together to do more research about showing the positive impact from a financial perspective of making sure you have diverse teams so you don't miss out on opportunities about bridesmaids. So you have somebody on your team that understands what the market is for things like that. I mean, I think that's exactly the right question to be asked. Yes?
Hi, I'm Sonia, and I've been in a very male-dominated industry in aerospace and defense for over 20 years. And I was always the only woman, you know. But I totally agree with you, having worked with a lot of people in this male-dominated industry, that there's a lot of good white guys, and they do want to, they do want to do the right thing. And I agree with you, there's not enough data. Maybe research isn't, I mean, McKinsey has put out a report that there's 35% better ROE when you have more than a quarter of your management is women, for example, right? There's a lot of this kind of data. But it's not in a way that we manage other business priorities. I totally agree. So, we are in a tech industry. I'm an engineer, tech background. And what do you see as application of tech? Do you see in all of your portfolio companies and all of the venture things that people are looking at tech applied to bring this data together? Lots of people put lots of reports out, they do surveys, but it's not all in a way that people can deal with and they can use it every day to make decisions, to know what works and what doesn't work. Have you seen anything like that? Do you see any beginnings of tech being applied to this problem?
Applying technology and innovation to the very problem that we're talking about inside technology and innovation.
We should have all these great ideas about how to solve this problem.
Yeah, I haven't yet, and that's sort of why I answered the question, like, I'd like to see more, because I don't think that the first one that comes out is going to be the best, right?
I would like to talk to you afterwards.
Okay, sounds good.
Is there one final question? Great. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you, Bobby, for the conversation.
Thanks.